Prime Minister Mark Carney is in Mexico this hour looking to strengthen ties as both countries say they're striving to lessen reliance on the United States.
None of these countries can survive if they don't sell to the United States. And when they sell to the United States, their exports.
What happens when the world's most powerful country decides to turn off the tap literally? Imagine waking up one morning to find out that the energy your cities, factories, and homes depend on has been cut off overnight. No warning, no gradual transition, just silence in the pipelines. That's exactly what Canada faced when Donald Trump redirected U.S. gas shipments away from its northern neighbor and sent them across oceans instead to Europe and Japan. But was this a punishment, a strategy, or something far bigger? A reminder that energy is not just fuel, but power. Chapter 1. The Shockwave. The announcement didn't come through whispers or leaks. It landed like a hammer. The United States was halting its gas shipments to Canada. For decades, the two countries had operated on a kind of unspoken trust. America supplied the energy. Canada built its industries, neighborhoods, and economy on the assumption that this supply would remain stable. That trust evaporated overnight. Prime Minister Mark Carney, usually composed and deliberate, was forced into a rare public outburst. His press conferences shifted from confident to desperate as he warned Canadian citizens of looming shortages and rising prices. Gas stations reported lines. Industries braced for disruptions. For ordinary families, heating bills began to creep up. The possibility of blackouts no longer felt like a distant scenario. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic and Pacific, Europe and Japan were smiling. Shipments that once traveled north were now streaming east and west in massive tankers. European leaders, eager to sever their dependence on Russian fossil fuels, saw this as perfect timing. New liquefied natural gas (LNG) terminals across the continent had been waiting for just such a moment. For Japan, energy security is always at the heart of its national strategy. Securing U.S. gas promised stability for its power grids and industries. So why Canada? Why now? The answer lies in scale. The U.S. can produce and export about 150 billion cubic meters of LNG each year, but global demand dwarfs that number. Europe alone could swallow 3 times the American supply, and Japan adds another mountain of demand. Canada, by comparison, is a much smaller player. Its infrastructure is limited, its market narrow. When Trump's team looked at the numbers, the choice was brutally clear. America would send its energy where it had the biggest global impact. Canada simply couldn't compete. Still, this wasn't framed as punishment. Trump himself emphasized that the redirection was about strategy and America first. He highlighted a massive trade deal with Japan, praising it as one of the largest in history, and tied it directly to new joint ventures in Alaskan energy. For Trump, every shipment wasn't just a sale, it was leverage. Energy wasn't merely a commodity. It was a tool to reward allies and reinforce global influence. But to Canada, it felt like betrayal. Cities that once relied on steady U.S. pipelines now scrambled for alternatives. Politicians and opposition parties unleashed criticism, asking why Canada hadn't prepared for the possibility that Washington might shift its priorities. Social media exploded with frustration. How could our government leave us this vulnerable? Became a trending refrain. The truth is, Canada's reliance on U.S. gas had been both a blessing and a trap. For years, cheap and steady American supply allowed Canada to avoid building stronger, independent infrastructure. When the tap was shut off, the weakness was exposed. And yet, while Canadians struggled, Trump's move was hailed as a masterstroke in Washington. By strengthening ties with Europe and Japan, the U.S. solidified its role as the indispensable energy partner for 2 of the world's most advanced economies. Billions in investment began flowing into American energy projects, from LNG terminals to pipelines in Alaska. American workers benefited from new jobs. U.S. companies reaped profits. Politically, Trump scored points both at home and abroad. The message was simple. Energy flows where America wants it to flow, and allies who can invest and scale will always take priority over neighbors who assume the pipeline will never run dry. But the ripple effects went far beyond trade. In global markets, prices shifted. Europe's energy bills stabilized as U.S. gas filled the void left by Russian sanctions. Japan secured new long-term contracts, ensuring fuel for its industries. Canada, meanwhile, scrambled to negotiate with other suppliers, but the transition was messy and expensive. The larger truth revealed itself quickly. Energy is not just about supply and demand, it's about power and leverage. And in this new order, Canada wasn't at the center. It was on the sidelines. The shock was only beginning. Chapter 2. The Game of Power. If Chapter 1 was about shock, Chapter 2 is about revelation. Once the dust began to settle, the true weight of Trump's decision became clear, not just for Canada, but for the entire world. The cut wasn't random. It was calculated, a chess move in a larger game of energy geopolitics. By redirecting shipments across oceans, Trump had drawn a line in the sand. America's resources would no longer flow out of convenience, but out of strategy. Allies who offered scale, infrastructure, and political alignment would receive priority. Everyone else, even long-standing neighbors like Canada, would have to fend for themselves. For Canada, this reality was devastating. Prime Minister Carney found himself under relentless fire from critics and citizens alike. Why weren't we ready? Why did we rely so heavily on American goodwill? Opposition parties painted him as complacent, blind to the risks of dependency. Canadian headlines buzzed with anger. Families braced for higher bills. Small businesses feared closures, and industries warned of layoffs. What was once an energy relationship built on trust now looked like a trap. At the same time, Trump seized every opportunity to showcase the benefits at home. American LNG was being purchased in record numbers. Europe announced a plan to spend nearly $750 billion over the next 3 years on U.S. energy, an amount large enough to erase its reliance on Russian imports entirely. Japan strengthened its security by tying its future energy needs to U.S. projects, including a joint venture in Alaska that promised to be one of the largest pipelines in the world. It was more than logistics. It was symbolism. For decades, global energy has been a story of dependence: Europe on Russia, Japan on the Middle East, and Canada on the United States. Now, the US was rewriting the rules. It wasn't just selling fuel, it was selling influence. Each shipment became a reminder of who held the cards. And this was the brilliance, or the ruthlessness, depending on your view. Trump didn't frame the move as hostile. He called it business. America first, he repeated. But in that phrase lay the deeper message. In the new order, even friends could be sacrificed if they weren't useful enough. For Europe, the decision was a lifeline. Russian energy, once a staple, had become politically toxic. American shipments not only stabilized markets, but also strengthened the continent's alliance with Washington. For Japan, the benefits were just as profound. Shorter shipping routes from Alaska meant cheaper, more reliable supply. Energy security, one of Tokyo's constant worries, was suddenly reinforced by U.S. cooperation. But for Canada, every redirected shipment was a reminder of its vulnerability. Without U.S. gas, Canada's smaller market and limited infrastructure left it scrambling for alternatives. Building new import routes would take years. In the meantime, shortages turned into political crises. Carney's government struggled to explain why one of the wealthiest nations on Earth hadn't prepared for an energy shock right at its doorstep. This is the danger of dependency. When a single supplier holds the key, the customer's comfort is an illusion. And in this case, Canada learned the lesson the hard way. Globally, the decision reshaped the balance of power. Analysts described it as a pivot moment in energy history. No longer was the U.S. just one exporter among many, it was the exporter that dictated terms. Countries understood that securing American energy wasn't just about contracts. It was about aligning with U.S. interests, proving themselves as strategic partners, and investing heavily in infrastructure to make themselves attractive markets. In the weeks that followed, ripple effects reached every corner of the world. Energy prices shifted. Political debates erupted, and one lesson became clear. Energy is not guaranteed, it's earned. But perhaps the most unsettling revelation came when analysts pointed out just how limited U.S. export capacity really is. With global demand far outstripping supply, the U.S. can't feed everyone. Choices must be made. And when choices must be made, some countries win and others lose. Trump made sure those choices benefited America first. Europe and Japan were winners. Canada, for now, was left in the cold. Yet even as Canada struggled, Trump's political position grew stronger. At home, he could point to job creation, booming exports and rising profits for American energy firms. Abroad, he could point to Europe and Japan as proof that U.S. leadership was indispensable. Even critics had to admit it was a shrewd move, but shrewdness often comes at a cost. For Canada, the cost was immediate: shortages, rising bills, political upheaval. For other countries watching from the sidelines, the cost was more subtle: a realization that in a world where energy is weaponized, no one is truly safe from the turn of a valve. And that's the suspenseful truth that lingers. If a close neighbor like Canada can be sidelined so abruptly, what does that mean for everyone else? Could Europe or Japan someday face the same fate if U.S. priorities shift again? Could allies discover that loyalty isn't enough when the numbers don't add up? The decision wasn't just about pipelines. It was about rewriting the rules of power. And in this new order, America doesn't just sell energy, sells certainty. It sells security. And for those who can't buy in, the consequences are harsh. Trump's move may have started as a redirection of gas shipments, but in the end, it did much more. It reminded the world that energy is the lifeblood of nations, and whoever controls that flow controls the future. For Canada, the nightmare is far from over. For the rest of the world, the warning is clear. So the question remains: if energy is power and power is leverage, how long before the next switch is flipped and whose lights go out next?